What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Eastern Currents. Today, it's Michael and I, and we are trying to get a podcast in between nap schedules. We're both stay-at-home dads on rainy days, and we're going to do our best to power through and get a podcast in for you. Today, we're going to talk about spring and summer flounder fishing. So, Michael and I both really enjoy flounder fishing, even if you can't keep fish. I mean, we just like targeting fish and catching the fish we're targeting. The cool thing about flounder is you're fishing a lot of areas that look fishy, and you get rewarded on good cast to points and creek mouths and whatnot. And it's they're a fun fish to fish for. I like trout as well, redfish as well. Everything, it's all fun, but flounder can really, push you to become a better angler as far as reading water and picking out fishy areas. Before we get into it too much, I want to let y'all know about the sponsor for this podcast. It's First Class Glass. They do custom fiberglass work on boats. They can redo motors. They can completely repaint your motor cowling and your pretty much your whole motor, or they can repaint your whole motor, make it look brand new. So if you're in the Wilmington area, the North Carolina area, and need full boat restoration, fiberglass repair, pretty much taking old boats and making them look brand new, First Class Glass is where you need to go. Also, hit up Ice Strike Fishing if you need any jig heads or any of their tackle. They've got a bunch of great stuff. And they're a sponsor of the show as well. Big supporter of everything Eastern Current. I actually got the pleasure of fishing with Dave up in Weldon the other day and caught a bunch of striper on Saltwater, caught a bunch of striper on their jigs and had a great time. But First Class Glass and Ice Strike Fishing, definitely check them out. Also, Marshwear clothing and AFCO clothing. Go check them out as well. Great. I'd say Marshwear's got a really good kind of life vibe going on, and AFCO is more of your serious sportwear. But definitely go check those out if you haven't. But that's enough of me chit-chatting, going through all that stuff. I'm pretty much out of breath. I need to go ahead and bring Michael on here because, like we said, we're trying to do this in between nap schedules. We'll see how much of a podcast we can get out there for y'all. So, what's up, man?
What's up?
I don't think I breathed in that whole time.
Not much. Just watching it rain outside.
Raining all day long.
But
yeah, so we're gonna talk spring flounder fishing. Michael, you whacked them pretty good the other day, didn't you?
yeah, we did pretty good. We got 10 total for about 4 hours of fishing, and 2 of them were right at 18 or 18 and a half. So some good size ones already starting to show up.
Heck yeah.
Typically, I'm starting, when the water temperature hits 65, you start to get a little influx of them. But once it gets up to that like 70 mark, we had a couple good warm days last week where it hit 90, 91. That water temperature really warmed up, and I think those fish started to move in.
Started
this
dumping.
cold snap that we've got right now with this cold rain, it's probably going to drop the water temperature back down, and they might move back out, or they might shut down for a little bit.
Yeah.
But as soon as that water temperature starts to warm up, definitely around that 70-degree mark is when I start to see them really start to show up good.
Okay.
And then, typical summertime, like good flounder fishing, I feel like is 75, 76, and up.
Definitely.
When they really starts cranking. But
it's always fun when you start seeing them this time of year too, and they're aggressive and they're eating, I think the first inshore flounder I caught was the beginning of March.
Oh, wow.
Which was early. I mean, there's always some flounder that hang around, but this was like a good sized flounder. It felt like it had pushed in from the ocean and whatnot. Yeah. But it also coughed up a massive menhaden, which I hadn't seen any of those at that point in the year, and so it was pretty funny. But yeah, me and Michael, we talk about it all the time. Flounder is such a great filler fish. On tougher tides, on tougher days, you can always go out and find some flounder. So let's talk a little bit about, and we've talked about it in podcasts in the past, but springtime fishing for them. So what kind of areas are you looking for spring into summer as this water warms up? We'll kind of call it like a late spring, early summer trend.
Typically, I'm starting, and we talk about this with trout, redfish, everything. Closer to the inlets, and I start working my way back. So like, I fished Saturday, for instance. I actually started in the inlet and fished right there as the tide was changing and we had a good current flow, and I drifted the inlet. I picked up 2 fish there. They were a little smaller, but at least gave me the idea, like, all right, they're starting to make the transition in shore. And then from there, I start checking the creeks closest, or I check my largest structure. So docks and drop-offs, points, ledges, that kind of stuff, within that half-mile kind of radius around the inlets. And I always have spots that I know in the back of my head that hold fish year after year after year. And those are kind of the spots that I go and target first, but they fall into those categories,
Right.
deep holes, big drop offs, ledges, whatever. I start checking there. So
If you had to pick one type of spot to fish this time of year for flounder, what would it be?
I think it would be drop offs right outside of creek mouths.
Yeah, I would agree. That's exactly what I was thinking. And like secondary deep holes and creek mouths too, but I think the drop offs and creek mouths, it's I mean pretty much inshore. That's a hard one not to target. Big structure too. That's another thing. Like fishing docks around inlets can be really productive as well this time of year. But I just don't fish docks as much. I know you fish docks pretty heavily for flounder, not necessarily redfish, but for flounder you really like dock fishing. Is there anything specific in the docks that you're looking for to catch flounder?
Docks are really just time consuming. That's kind of the biggest thing for me. If you fish like the creeks and the drop offs like you're talking about, if you hit those areas with 3 or 4 casts and you don't pick up a fish, there's probably not one there at this time of year because they're super aggressive. They're looking for something to eat. It's the reason why they're coming inshore. They're following the first bits of bait in. But on the docks and stuff, you just got to take your time to pick them apart. I will say higher tides I feel like are better for them. This time of year, they don't seem to like to sit nearly as shallow as they do during the summer. So targeting them on either the last bit of incoming or the top of the fall, especially if you're in that 4 to 5 foot range, I feel like it's a little better watered up too sometimes.
Yeah.
But picking a dock apart, finding that one little spot where they're sitting, because it's not there's just not the numbers here right now for them, for multiple fish to be on every single dock. It can happen, but it's typically 1, maybe 2 fish, and they're sitting right behind a pole or a post or something waiting for that bait to come around.
Yeah.
And so it's just taking your time and really picking it apart.
How important would you say it is for you, like this time of year, to be fishing around large amounts of bait? Because it seems... Yeah, it seems like, that's a question I get quite often. Like, are you trying to find the bait and fish around the bait? But, the bait's transitionary too right now, which is kind of what I've learned is like, it's not necessarily holding in one spot. It's moving through. So these fish are putting themselves in places along that transitionary path, stopping and feeding, whether that be redfish, trout, or flounder. But so you're about the same. You're not necessarily like looking for bait for flounder fishing.
No, I mean, if I see bait, that's great, but most of the time I'm more paying attention to location, because especially this time of year, the water's just not quite warm enough for the bait to be super active right up on the surface, that kind of stuff. The water right now is cool enough that it's still holding a pretty large amount of oxygen, so the bait, like mullet and stuff, you'll see them a lot of times during the summer right up at the surface because they're gulping air and that kind of stuff, making disturbances, helping oxygenate the water, because that water, the oxygen level drops a lot during the summer. But right now the water temperature is cool enough; it's still holding a lot of oxygen. So just because you're not seeing them on the surface doesn't mean that they're not in those same areas. They just may be swimming down deeper.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point for sure. So when these fish are hanging out deeper this time of year, is there anything specific you change in the way that you target them or how you approach them or how you're fishing for them?
I definitely upsize my jig head. I want to make sure I almost always have bottom contact, especially for flounder and like those deep drop spots. We were talking about ledges and stuff. I want to be able to cast up shallow, work it off of that, and make sure it drops from that shallow, get it over the ledge, and let it drop into kind of the deeper holes. And make sure I'm getting bottom contact without that bait just blowing through the hole with the current.
Right.
More of like trout and stuff, I want to be able to work it, and I want it to stay kind of right off the bottom, or just kind of bump it right up, let it bump it and let it come up off the bottom and kind of move around in the current. When I'm fishing more for flounder, I'm throwing quarter, 3/6 quarter, 3/8 or a half ounce
Okay.
jig head. a lot of times. The half ounce, that's more of like right at the mouth of the inlet. I want to make sure I get down, in those heavy current situations, but more inshore, 1/4 and 3/8 is, kind of the thing. Especially because I fish a lot of Z-Man too, just to get that much action, but they're also naturally buoyant, so you want to go with something a little heavier to make sure you get it down.
Right.
So, and I think it's
I'm sorry, go ahead.
key to, like, when you get a hit, like being able to discern what the bottom is versus a hit, that kind of stuff.
When you're trying to maintain contact in that deeper water, fishing some of that current and whatnot, is there any type of retrieve style or positioning in how you position your boat, anything like that comes into play as far as like getting a good productive cast? Are you sitting there throwing up current into it? Are you throwing down current? Like, are you sitting and throwing side current and swinging it, rod tip up, rod tip down, like anything like that?
Most of the time I'm positioning my boat down current of where I want to fish, and I'm throwing up current. That way I can let the line, a lot of times when I'm doing this, I'll pitch my bait up, open the bell, and let it just drop freely.
Gotcha.
And then close the bell once I say give it, 2-3 seconds to make sure it hits the bottom. Close the bell, rod tip up, and I fish rod tip up most of the time for flounder, and that's just because it keeps the least amount of water actually in the line, or the least amount of line in the water, so that you have more sensitivity.
Yeah.
If it's windy or whatever, I'll put my rod tip down, but for the most part, I'm keeping it up.
Yeah, that's what I like to do as well. Flout, trout or flounder, with that rod tip up if I can. When it gets windy, you get too much bow in the line, you really can't feel anything. But
yeah,
God, when you got a calm day and you can just have 3 or 4 feet of line in the water, you can feel everything. I mean, you can really tell then if it's a shell or if it's a fish. All right. So the age-old question, I'm just kind of drilling you today with questions. I guess that's how this podcast is going to go. The age-old question is like, if you're fishing an artificial or a live bait. Well, we've just been talking artificial. So when do you set the hook? You feel what you think is a bite. Are you the kind of guy that jacks them right off the bat, or are you sitting there and waiting 30 seconds? Because I'm definitely not the one that waits 30 seconds.
This time of year, when I feel it hit, most of the time I'm setting the hook right there.
Yeah.
And the fish right now are so aggressive because there's such a small amount of bait in the area. When they want to eat, they're ready to eat, they'll attack it.
Yeah.
Like, I think Saturday we hooked maybe 12 or 13. We lost one right beside the boat, and the other two, came off pretty quick. So kept pulling our skirts down, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some short strikers out there right now, but that could also have been lizardfish and other stuff. So
that would be a really good band name, Short Strikers. I don't know why that just popped in my head. I'm crazy, but I feel like I think there's probably a lot of little ones around this time of year too. The ones that just pull the pants down and whatnot. My kind of rule of thumb, and the way I've kind of developed my artificial flounder fishing is like, I don't wait long, but if I feel like I got a bite, I kind of give it 3 seconds, check that pressure, like wiggle it a little bit, because you got to imagine if a flounder comes up, here's a bait fish swimming, and eats the bait fish. It's very used to feeling that bait fish probably moving around in its mouth trying to escape. You know what I mean? You don't have to just give it dead slack. In all honesty, it might actually help if you've got a little bit of movement on that bait. But so I'll kind of, I'll feel that thump. And so I sit there, give it 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, then I'll kind of check to see if that pressure's still there 2 or 3 times, like in a row. And if it's there, I'm reeling down and setting the hook. That's kind of how I've always played around with it. And even in the ocean. And I was actually just watching an ocean video I did last year, flounder fishing by myself before a guide trip. And, I feel pretty good about my, not waiting too long to set the hook. But then I'm sitting there and I watched myself pull it out of like 4 fish's mouths, only giving them like 5 seconds to eat it. So I think bait fishing, you might as well let them choke it. But if you can't keep them right now, like I wouldn't let them choke it too long, because they might get it in the stomach and you're going to end up killing them. But as far as artificials go, give them 3-4 seconds and hit them is kind of how I feel about it. Because you're not going to hit, if they are a real mouthy flounder, I don't think you're going to really hook them well on the jig anyways. So
no. Hang on 1 second. We got to pass you down, and I'll be right back.
Yep. I will.
You can continue on without me.
Yep, I'll continue on without you. So, with that being said, we're talking there about artificial and how long to wait to set the hook. And I was talking about watching that video of myself, and not and realizing how many fish I was missing on bait. And so I think it's really just a matter of that day of fishing. It's like just some days you're throwing topwaters for redfish and those fish come up and crush a topwater that you don't miss a single one. Other days they're just kind of waking the bait or pushing it a little bit and you really can't get them hooked. It's nice to kind of read into each day and be able to make a decision based on when to set the hook on those flounder, depending upon how the fish are acting. So there's no hard fast rule, but being able to kind of key into how the fish are acting. I'm just scrambling here. I got real nervous when Michael walked off. So key in on how long to wait before you set the hook. But rule of thumb, jig, give them 3 to 5 seconds. Check that weight. And then with the bait, if you're fishing during keeper season, which we have here, other places there's no such thing as keeper season. You can just keep them all year. You can give them a little bit longer. But you hate to gut hook a little one or gut hook one when you can't keep them. Anything else you want to add to that, Michael?
No, I think you pretty much hit it. Like I say, like this time of year, I'm pretty quick with the jig. But once we get 75, 80 degree water temps, and then we get into a full summertime fishing for flounder, I mean, I'm like you. I let it sit there for a little longer, that 3 to 5 seconds or whatever, with the jig head, make sure they're there. So, but no, I think that you're on par with the same thing I do.
Sweet. So, do you think that the places that you're catching these fish are going to change over the next month or two as we get into like June and July? Or once flounder come inshore, are they kind of like, because redfish, it can change a lot, but flounder, it feels like, and this might be my lack of flounder knowledge, but it feels like once they're in, they're just kind of doing their thing. They're just in the spots that they're going to be in. What's your opinion on that? And maybe not as shallow or using the spots the same way, but what's your opinion on that?
No, I mean, I definitely feel like they stay pretty close to the same spots. A flounder's going to move to put itself in the best aim spot as the tide comes in and goes out, and that water level rises and drops.
You were saying put themselves in the best ambush spot? Sorry, it split off there for a second.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they put themselves, in the best ambush spot, and that ambush spot's going to be the same today, tomorrow, this summer, this fall, whenever you're fishing for them. So, I mean, you can really start putting together a good flounder pattern starting now and be able to stay on that same pattern throughout the year.
Yeah.
Now, like you said, they don't always use the areas the same, because right now I don't feel like I can go to the back of a creek somewhere and effectively flounder fish. I just don't think they're there yet.
Yeah.
But as far as those places that are close to inlets, close to the creek mouths, that kind of stuff, they're going to be there, and they're going to be fish there throughout the year.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I don't think that part's going to change much.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's, kind of they're slowly transitioning into the back. But just because it's a spot they're already using right now doesn't mean that they won't be there at the middle of the summer, I guess.
Yep. And two, now's a great time because the fish are so aggressive. You've heard me say it before, I power fish a lot.
Yeah.
I pick apart, a small dock, and I fish 3, 4, 5 casts to where I think they're going to be sitting or where I've known them to sit in years past. Mm-hmm. And if they're not there, I'm moving on to the next dock. Yeah. And that gives me the ability, to cover water quickly. And I'll do that. I'll pass by the same spots 3 times in a day sometimes. Hit it at a high tide, hit it at a mid tide, and hit it at a low tide.
For sure.
And that'll give you, especially right now when we can't keep them, that's going to give you the option to figure out where those fish are sitting at a high tide, where some of those fish are sitting at a mid tide, where they're sitting at a low tide, and how they transition through those certain areas. So that the next time you go out, all right, it's a mid tide. They were sitting underneath this dock float last week.
Yeah.
That's where I need to fish,
Yeah.
So you can really, really dial the flounder in to that kind of degree by making multiple passes in the same spot.
Yeah, flounder almost seemed to be like, a redfish or a sheep's head could be, where it's like they're on this piling of this dock or under this corner of the floating dock. And you can be like that in a creek. Like there's this little point, this little tiny micro point on this bank always has a flounder. And I mean, I can't tell you how many spots like that I've got, especially in the river, where I can, I'm not going to hook one every time, but like if you make the right cast 90% of the time, I'm not saying like every cast you make up there, but if you go hit it once a day, you can pull a flounder off of it. It's just like how a trout, like a rainbow trout or a brown trout, is going to find a primary position in a river, a good spot to sit. The bait's going to flow around. Like those spots exist out in the marsh as well, and those flounder are going to fall into those spots. If you take one out of there, another one's going to come find it because it's productive.
Yep.
I think you can also catch flounder kind of out in no man's land, but kind of keying in on those little points, those little creek mouths, those little oyster rocks can definitely point you in the right direction. And like I said, they're just so fun because you can be red fishing, sight fishing for redfish, and then you can be like, I don't usually see them in this zone. Fire 10 cast off to your next place and pick up a flounder, maybe sometimes two flounder, if you know where to make those casts. And that's why it's, they're just a fish that too many people that like to fish how we fish overlook and say, I don't care about catching flounder. They don't fight. You can't see to eat. It's all about the reward of a good cast and knowing where they live. So,
well, and two, something to add, we were talking about like how they use certain areas. Between now and summertime, as the numbers get bigger, or as more fish start moving inshore, the highly productive areas that you're finding now are going to hold more than just one fish this summer.
Right.
That was something that I started to learn last year, is like where I caught fish early in the season, if it's a big enough habitat area, we're not talking just one small deep hole in a creek somewhere. But, if you find a long, deep slough or something that's got a good bank or a good little creek coming into it, whatever, and that spot's 10 feet by 10 feet or 15 by 15 feet, something that's a little bit bigger, typically there's going to be multiple fish holding on that same area. So once you catch one, go ahead, spend the extra time to make 10, 12 more casts and cover just slightly off of the spot where you caught that fish, left and right. And a lot of times once you start getting into the summer and more numbers are here, you're going to be able to pick up more fish in that same spot.
Yeah, I agree, man. That's what's so cool about it. And I would say that trend kind of plays true with redfish and with black drum and with other inshore fish, but flounder for sure. I mean, flounder, that's like a cold hard rule. One thing I do want to talk about though is, and I know, like we said, dock fishing can be tedious, but I always share with people that ask, a dock is way more straightforward than a creek. You know what I mean? As far as going and fishing it and picking it apart and feeling like you've covered it well and haven't left anything behind. So I do want to spend some time talking about flounder fishing docks. So if you're approaching a dock, or say you're going to fish a stretch of docks, and I remember the first time I ever did really good dock fishing, I was fishing a finger mullet and a jig head off my parents' dock at Topsail. And this was off like a little crappy kayak as a kid. And I was with Damon, my brother. Damon was on a kayak too. And we both had like a little tow behind, little live well bucket thing and some mullet. And we fished like 8 docks. I can't tell anybody where the dock is, or these docks are going to get hammered. But we fished like 8 docks north, like our dock, and then 8 docks north, and then we caught like 11 flounder and 3 redfish. It was just me and him. We didn't know what we were doing. This is back in like middle school, and we were just like hopping mullet on jig heads on our docks. But that's the cool thing for like the kayak guys, man, is you can really fish docks well. Like you could put in at Topsail or Wrightsville Beach or any of these places and just stay under the docks the whole day because you can paddle right under them. And just pick all those docks apart from like the bank out, which I think is probably one of the better ways to pick them apart. But if you're going in and fishing a dock, and you want to kind of work through docks and try to find productive docks, take me through like how many casts you're making, the angles, how you're setting the boat up, and when you're like, all right, done with this dock, moving to the next one. And then also share with me like what type of lure or bait you like to do it with to feel like you've searched it well.
So
and I'm gonna sit back and drink this lemonade.
This time of year, like I pick apart a lot of docks on the intercoastal. So depending on the tide, I try to hit them more on like the upper to incoming tide or the top of the fall. I want that deeper water. Most of the time I'm going to set on the down current side and put my nose of the boat, with the trolling motor into the current. And that just gives me good control of moving from the deepest outer part of the dock all the way up to the bank and kind of staying exactly where I want. So from there, I will take and pick normally either the furthest outside line of post or that first gap between the outside post.
Gotcha.
And fish that at least 2 to 3 casts. So my first cast is going to be shortest. It's going to be right up to the back post, maybe a foot or two past it. Open up the bell, make sure that bait gets down. Because if you close your bell as soon as your line comes out of your rod tip and your bait hits here, if you close the bell, now you've started a pendulum swing back to you.
Yeah,
so you want
that's
to
a
make
really
sure
good point.
you leave that bell open so that bait can freely fall straight down. There's going to be some current push, but it's not going to be that pendulum swing to pull it away. So first thing, cast it in there. A lot of times I just put my hand over the line, over the bell, or hold it in my fingers after I cast. I don't even close the bell for the first few seconds. Just let it sit there. Now close the bell, and a lot of times just that free slack of letting that bait, especially like Z-Mans or other buoyant plastics, it gives it a lot more movement versus just that straight swing back to the boat. So I'll start with that, jig a little bit, work it past that post, get maybe 2 feet behind the post. When I'm dock fishing, I'm really just oriented on the structure, not really what's around it. Pick it up, the next post in, closer into the middle, next post in on the next cast, and I slowly work my way into it, because I found, especially like when red fishing, and this doesn't really have to do with flounder, but with red fishing, if you cast it right, in the middle of the school, and all the fish spook away from it.
Right.
So, going into summertime, there's still some schools of redfish around. If you happen into one of those, you just don't want to blow out whatever's underneath there. If there's, trout, drum, whatever. So I'll just kind of pick it apart, easing my bait farther and farther up underneath the dock. Then from there, I typically go to the back of it. So, you got your main dock with like pavilion or whatever out on the end, and then you got your walkway. I'll go from the very farthest outside to right behind that where it converges down, and I fish that little section. And then
I feel like a lot of times that's where the flounder are, on that little kick in, not out on the front. You'll catch them out on the front of the dock, but like wherever it goes from like big dock where all the boat stuff is to like that corner to the straightaway to the walking part is where I catch them. Sorry, keep going.
No, you're good. I mean, I feel like that holds true for me for like 75% of the docks. That is the area where I catch them. And I think that's just because it gets the least amount of like wave action, boat action, that kind of stuff coming in right there. It's kind of protected. And it kind of gives a line for bait traveling down. If they hit the post on the walkway out, they kind of travel those posts a lot of times too, if you watch the bait. So, but then from there, if it's a really high tide and there's water all the way up to the grass, and you got a foot and a half at least up against the grass line, I'll skip from there to maybe the last 4 or 5 sections of dock pilings going up to the grass, fish those, and then come back out and around and skip to the next dock. Now when I make the transition out in the intercoastal and I'm along the front of the docks, I'll make a few casts there. Same idea of making sure that bait gets down to the bottom. And if it's a really big dock that I can't cover all the way from one side, from the down current side, once I get around to the other side, if I can hold myself in position, I'll spot lock and walk to the back of the boat and pitch, a few around. But most of the time I don't even worry about it, because when you're fighting a flounder and they turn sideways, as much as they move, a lot of times you just end up breaking fish off in those docks when you're trying to fish them from the up current side versus the down current side. Because with the down current side, they're getting pushed out from where they're at. Once you get their head turned and pulled down current, they're kind of coming with you.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
yeah, they've got much more of a play when you're up current of them. Yeah, I think that I wouldn't share anything else on that. That's pretty perfect. So, what kind of bait do you like to throw? I'll share mine, and then you share yours, and I'll share mine. What kind of artificial do you like to throw when you're dock fishing?
This time of year, I start with like a 3/8 jig head with a white, like 4 or 5 inch paddle tail. 5 inch, I kind of wait till more into the summer.
Yeah.
And like this time of year is more of like the 4 inch. I feel like the 4 inch bait kind of keeps a lot of like lizard fish and that kind of stuff off my bait. So that 4 inch is kind of the size I stick with.
Yeah.
And then once I start seeing the mullet show up or they're starting to get a little bigger, then I'll switch over to that 5 inch bait and go with that pretty much all summer long.
Yeah, that's a good point right there, man. Like I like fishing big baits for flounder, but not until there's bigger baits around. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not that they won't eat it, but kind of match the hatch. Well, I mean, once those bigger mullet are swimming the banks pretty good, those 5-6 inch mullet, like big old long fluke, like a 6-7 inch fluke, you can get away with that inshore. But it's also kind of a pain to fish something that large. But yeah, I'm a big fan of white too, chartreuse, but usually white. They'll eat naturals too, but they're aggressive fish, and so just throwing something that you know they're going to see that you can work quickly and whatnot. It's like power finesse fishing is what flounder fishing is. I feel like
Exactly.
So combining the two opposites, power finesse. But well, cool. Well, I'm trying to think. We went through that, and I would say similarly, you can fish bridges, you can fish other big pieces of structure, jetties the same way. And one big thing is just changing the angle up, like Michael was saying. Like you'll fish a dock from one side and you'll flip it around and go the other way, and something about your bait coming that way, you'll catch 2 or 3 fish off of it. So just because you hit it from one side or one corner or one angle, don't be afraid to go back in. I'm still letting everybody look at you while I talk. To go back in and hit it from a different angle. That's definitely a big thing. And with a lot of, I see that with striper a lot too. Like changing your angle up just a little bit can really, really help with getting those fish to eat. But yeah, so I think that's kind of a good start on spring flounder fishing. Is there anything else, Mike, that you can think that we kind of need to move into and cover a little bit?
I would say the only thing, so there's a lot of docks that are kind of within creeks or, a little tighter. They're not just like the intercoastal, so you're not able to get around and fish like the backsides, or they don't have those long walkways.
Right.
I still fish the fronts of them very similarly, but when I start, and the way I fish it is more like I'm trout fishing. Like I pitch up current and I bounce it and just let the current move the bait.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to cover water and jig it and make, 10, 15 casts and cover the whole front of the dock. That is the one time I'll step down to a quarter, 3/16, whatever, with that big 4-inch, Z-man, and pitch it up underneath the edge of it while I'm sitting off the front, nose into the current with the boat, pitch up current, and just pick it up and hop it and let the current move it more than me trying to make, all those casts and cover that amount of water.
Yeah.
So
no,
and I don't know if that makes a huge difference, but to me, I feel like I cover the water more effectively because my bait is staying down there on the strike, down on the bottom where those flounder can see it for a longer period of time versus just sticking it in 3 or 4 different places, 5 places, how many ever casts you make, and them only getting to see it, for the 3 or 4 feet that you're in that spot on every retrieve. Yeah,
I think that's huge. One other thing too is, so many people fish fluke style baits, like, jerk shad, fluke, jerk bait style, soft plastics for flounder. What is your take on that? And how often are you fishing that? How often are you fishing a paddle tail?
I'm a huge believer in the paddle tail. I like the thump.
Yeah.
Having something that gives off a little bit more push of water, I think, especially in deeper water, water that's not got great visibility is better. But flukes and stuff, I've caught fish on them. I'm not going to say that, they don't work. They definitely do. I think, though, I use that in more clear water or when I'm targeting fish that are a lot shallower, where I want basically just that movement for that fish to be able to see it.
Yeah.
I'm
with you. I would say the paddle tail, man, this fish can feel that thump of the tail so much better. It's more of a, not finesse, but it's more of a realistic type of bait. You're pulling those bites out of fish too that might not be really wanting to eat, but that fluke is such a reactionary bite. That thing darts, dart, and then, they're just eating it based off of a pure, reaction and instinct. But, 6 1, half a dozen the other. They're both great choices. And you ask 5 different people, you probably get 5 different. Well, you can't get 5 different answers. You'd have 2 different answers. But yeah.
And I think, too, with flukes and stuff, I feel like I would fish them more in calmer water, like where there's not as heavy of a current flow. And I think that's just because of the effective ability, in my opinion, to be able to work that bait.
Yeah.
Like when I'm flounder fishing, I'm fishing a lot of like clear water from Wrightsville Beach to Topsail, that kind of area. So like visibility wise, most of the time it's pretty good, but I'm fishing a lot of heavy current flow unless it's, right there at the ends of the tides. So I feel like a lot of times just that having that slender profile with the tail that works really, really well. It's a little stiffer than the flukes and stuff. I prefer, but like if I go down to the river or somewhere that doesn't have quite that much current flow in some areas, then yeah, flukes and stuff like that I think are great.
Yeah, for sure. I would like to know everyone's opinion too. If you are listening to this podcast, or more so even just watching it on YouTube, just shoot a comment over, like if you'd rather fish a fluke or a paddle tail, because that is always such a debate. Like a lot of guys don't swap over. It's like they either fish a fluke or they fish a paddle tail, and that's it. So let us know what you like to fish in the comment section, and we'll talk about it in the next episode, because I'm curious to see, like, out of everyone that listens to this, what's everyone's favorite flounder bait. You can even let us know like the color and style of bait that you like to fish, inshore or nearshore. Because it's funny, it's one of those, it's like trout fishing, man. It's like, it's like the hot olive broken glass MR17 with a 5-second pause and 3 twitches and then 2 twitches. That people can get like that dialed on their flounder soft plastic. So, man, we covered creeks, we covered docks, we covered what we like to throw. Is there a specific jig head weight that you gravitate to, or is it completely like situational?
Completely situational. I have a handful of jig heads that just sit on my console, and either I tie out 3, 4, 5, 6 different times a day, or I've got 4 rods in the boat and I've got one of each size on there. Yeah. So, and then if I break off, I just kind of go from there for whatever I need to tie on.
Yeah, for sure. So I've confessed this on here before, but I'd never know the weights of jig heads. Like someone's like, "Oh, what weight is that?" And I'm terrible with numbers. And so I look at all my jig heads. I've got all the weights, and I know what I need to throw, but I'm like, "Oh, is this a 3/16 or a 1/8 ounce or 3/14 or a 22nd? I don't know what it is." But this is the weight I need to be throwing. If you ever ask me and I don't straight up answer you the correct way, it's because you made me nervous and I can't remember what the number is for the jig head that I was using. I've definitely kind of copped out of some YouTube comments before, like, what size jig head was that you caught that third redfish on or something like that? And I'm like, oh, it's situational. I can't remember, but eventually one of these days I'm gonna have them all memorized. But like I said, it's all about feel and seeing the jig head for me. So that's just me making an excuse of why I can't memorize numbers, but I've never been able to in my entire life. So, but yeah, I would say the same for me. I mean, I fish a 3/16 a lot. That's like my go-to inshore jig head. But with flounder, I will go a little bit heavier, like trying to tend bottom nicely. If I'm in deeper water and more current, I will definitely go heavier. But you like the eye strikes as well?
Eye strikes. When it comes to flounder fishing, a lot of times I just go with whatever's, I hate to say it, but kind of the cheapest.
Yeah, I like it.
And that's just because in your dock fishing and everything else, everybody's gotten one stuck on a piling, got one stuck in a guide wire, broke something off, it happens. So instead of throwing away dollar jig heads, it's just easier to buy the cheap things from Walmart sometimes.
Oh yeah, I agree.
But hook is even though I buy a cheaper jig head, I still make sure I get the kind of hook style that I like, which is more of that wide gap, longer shank hook style.
Yeah.
So.
You like a thin wire or a kind of heavy duty wire for flounder?
I prefer more of a stiffer wire if I can get it, and that's just because I use the jig heads for trout, flounder, redfish, and I feel like for flounder and redfish, I definitely like that heavier wire hook. Trout, not as much, it kind of goes either way. I don't really care, but I definitely like that heavier hook for both flounder and redfish.
Yeah, for sure. Well, dude, I think we've covered it well. I think I hear Scarlett up. Is she up and talking?
Yeah, she is. Passy is down again.
Passy's down. Well, Mike, thanks for hopping on here and doing a flounder podcast. We're going to do more as season progresses, but, like we said, it's a great fish to go out there and just add to your day. and become a better angler so that you can smack them good when season comes in if you want to keep a couple. And hopefully, eventually, we won't have a season again. Hopefully, we'll be able to keep flounder year round. But
Yes, sir.
we'll just see what happens. But Mike, thanks so much, man. I know you need to run. You guys, we're not going to do Patreon content tonight just due to our busy schedule this evening. But if you have not checked out our Patreon page, go over there and check it out. We got tons of extra content, uploading it very regularly, multiple times a month, not always every week. And as we get into the summer, we're gonna add some more stuff into that. But as always, Mike and I thank y'all for coming on and checking out the podcast. And we will see y'all next week. Later.